Hare Krishna devotees, welcome to day 81 of our Bhakti Vaibhava seminar on Srimad Bhagavatam, 3rd Canto. Today we're starting the 28th chapter of the 3rd Canto, which is titled Kapila's Instructions on the Execution of Devotional Service. Right, okay, let us begin. There are 3 sections here. There's 44 verses altogether, which we've divided into 3 sections. First section is verse 1 to verse 12, which we've titled Kapila Describes the Process of Yoga. Verse 1 to verse 12. Kapila describes the process of yoga. Section 2, verse 13 to verse 34. He describes meditation on the form of the Lord. He, of course, is Kapila. Verse 13 to verse 34. He describes meditation on the form of the Lord. And then the last section, 3rd section, verse 35 to verse 44, Kapila explains the result of that meditation. Okay, so let us begin. We begin with our prayers. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharane Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschachade Jatarne Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadha Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Vanchkalpatarubhyas Kripa Sindhubhya Eva Cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Okay, so here we are, devotees, day 81. Bhakti Vaibhava Seminar, Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 28, Kapila's Instructions on the Execution of Devotional Service. Okay, and first section, verse 1 to verse 12, Kapila describes the process of yoga. So, right, let's go through the verses. Verse 1, the personality of Godhead said, "My dear mother, O daughter of the king, now I shall explain to you the system of yoga, the object of which is to concentrate the mind. By practicing this system, one can become joyful and progressively advance towards the path of the absolute truth." Verse 2, one should execute his prescribed duties to the best of his ability and avoid performing duties not allotted to him. One should be satisfied with as much gain as he achieves by the grace of the Lord, and one should worship the lotus feet of a spiritual master. Verse 3, one should cease performing conventional religious practices and should be attracted to those which lead to salvation. One should eat very frugally and should always remain secluded so that he can achieve the highest perfection of life. Verse 4, one should practice non-violence and truthfulness, should avoid thieving, and be satisfied with possessing as much as he needs for his maintenance. He should abstain from sex life, perform austerity, be clean, study the Vedas, and worship the supreme form of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Verse 5. One must observe silence, acquire steadiness by practicing different yogic postures, control the breathing of the vital air, withdraw the senses from sense objects, and thus concentrate the mind on the heart. 6. Fixing the vital air in the mind in one of the 6 circles of vital air circulation within the body, thus concentrating one's mind on the transcendental pastimes of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So this is called samadhi or samadhana of the mind. Verse 7. By these processes, or any other true process, one must control the contaminated, unbridled mind, which is always attracted by material enjoyment, and thus fix himself in thought of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. 8. After controlling one's mind and sitting postures, one should spread a seat in a secluded and sanctified place. Sit there in an easy posture, keeping the body erect, and practice breath control. Verse 9. The yogi should clear the passage of vital air by breathing in the following manner. First, he should inhale very deeply, then hold the breath in, and finally exhale. Or, reversing the process, the yogi can first exhale, then hold the breath outside, and finally inhale. This is done so that the mind may become steady and free from external disturbances. Verse 10. The yogis who practice such breathing exercises are very soon freed from all mental disturbances, just as gold, when put into fire and fanned with air, becomes free from all impurities. Verse 11. By practicing the process of pranayama, one can eradicate the contamination of his physiological condition, and by concentrating the mind, one can become free from all sinful activities. By restraining the senses, one can free himself from material association, and by meditating on the Supreme Personality of Godhead, one can become free from the 3 modes of material attachment. Verse 12. When the mind is perfectly purified by this practice of yoga, one should concentrate on the tip of the nose with half-closed eyes and see the form of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Okay, so it's very interesting, isn't it? My gosh. So let's go into it in depth, the verses with their purports. So it's Kapila describing the process of yoga from verse 1 to verse 12. Verse 1, the Personality of Godhead said, "My dear mother, O daughter of the king, now I shall explain to you the system of yoga, the object of which is to concentrate the mind. By practicing this system, one can become joyful and progressively advance towards the path of the absolute truth." Okay, so we have a purport here. Prabhupada begins the purport by saying that the yoga process which Lord Kapila is describing here in this chapter is authorized and standard. It's not just concocted by someone. And therefore, if you're going to follow this particular process of yoga, which as devotees we may not entirely do, but anyway, if you're going to, you should follow the instructions very carefully, because by doing so, you can make progress towards understanding the absolute truth, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So in the previous chapter, it was made clear that the desired result of yoga, of this form of yoga, is not to achieve mystic power, but rather it's only to understand the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And it's also confirmed in the Bhagavad Gita, right at the end of the 6th chapter, that he who constantly thinks of Krishna is the greatest yogi. So there's a second paragraph here. So it's stated, we read, in fact, this very first verse says, if you follow this path, you'll become joyful. So here then, Lord Kapila, Supreme Personality of Godhead, highest authority on yoga, is explaining Ashtanga Yoga, Ashtanga, 8 limbs, 8 specific practices, yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. And the idea is that by doing these stages of practice, you must realize, you should realize Lord Vishnu, who's the target of all yoga. Yama means things you must not do. Niyama means things you must do. Asana means physical exercises. Pranayama means breathing exercises. Pratyahara means like beginning to focus the mind. Dharana means focusing the mind more deeply. Dhyana means focusing the mind so much that you're in meditation. And then samadhi means going into trance, yogic trance. So the end result, Prabhupada says, is to realize Lord Vishnu. He's actually the target of all yoga. But generally the other yoga practices, so many of them, they emphasize concentrating the mind on voidness or on something impersonal. But this is not approved by Lord Kapila, and his process has not got that in mind. And even Patanjali, who's the great teacher of Ashtanga Yoga, actually, and particularly Hatha Yoga, the physical exercises, he explains that the target of all yoga is Lord Vishnu. So therefore, Ashtanga Yoga is part of the Vaishnav process, because its ultimate goal is to realize the Supreme Lord, Lord Vishnu. So anyway, again, the goal is not mystic yoga. That was condemned in the previous chapter. But the goal is to get free from material designations and come to one's constitutional position. That's the ultimate achievement in yoga practice. So verse 2, one should execute his prescribed duties to the best of his ability and avoid performing duties not allotted to him. One should be satisfied with as much gain as he achieves by the grace of the Lord, and one should worship the lotus feet of a spiritual master. So Prabhupada makes the point that this verse has many important words in it. And he points us, first of all, he points us to the final, the last part, the last line of the Sanskrit, Atmavich Charanarchanam, which means Well, Atma Vit, by Sandhi, the laws of how the last letters of a word change when they meet the first letters of the next word. So Atmavit being the original form, Atmavit means a self-realized soul. Or, Prabhupada says, a bona fide spiritual master. And Prabhupada makes the point that unless you're self-realized, unless you know what your relationship with the Supersoul is, one cannot be a bona fide spiritual master. So here, of course, as we read, it's recommended. It's actually stated basically, more or less as a necessity, that one should seek out a bona fide spiritual master and surrender unto him, archanam. Because by doing like this, you can learn spiritual activities. So the very first thing in the first line was swadharmarcharanam. And the point is, as long as we have this material body, there are various prescribed duties for us. And it depends, such duties are divided in terms of one's varna, or one's ashram also. Varna, Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Sudra. And this is all, of course, described in scripture. And you have to do your duties very faithfully and to the best of your ability, and not accept someone else's duty. You know that Arjuna, he was thinking like that at the beginning of Bhagavad Gita. No fighting. He's a Kshatriya, but he had made up his mind, I am not going to fight. So what's he actually going to do? He suggested going away to the Himalayas and doing meditation. This is a practice of the Brahmins, and not even all of them, but this is a Brahminical practice, that's a fact. So Lord Krishna told him that you must not do that. Better to do your own duty imperfectly than to do someone else's duty, even if you do the other person's duty perfectly. Because, I mean, it's a bit of a subtle point, but because your duty, like in Arjuna's case, is Kshatriya duty, even though at the time he didn't want to do it, but it was very deeply ingrained in his system. So even if he does something else for the time being, in due course he'll come back to his prescribed duty, because it's deeply ingrained. So better, even if there's sort of like a momentary lapse or just some difficulty of some sort in your regular duty, best just to do it. And Prabhupada makes the point, if you're born in a particular society or community, you should do the prescribed duties of, anyway, whatever your duty is. But the thing is, having said that, the thing is, if you actually manage to transcend your physical existence, your psychological existence, if you transcend your gross and subtle bodies, then your natural duty, the Sanskrit term is actually swadharma. Going back to that first line of the verse, you see that the word is swadharmarcharanam, which is just sort of an expanded form of the term swadharma. Swa means your own, and dharma means your duty. So if you come to that transcendental level, then your duty is simply to serve the Lord, and that's all. So anyone who's advanced in Krishna consciousness, all they have to do is serve the Lord. But of course, as long as you remain in the bodily concept of life, then you can act, in fact, you generally must act according to the duties of social convention. So if you're a Brahmin, you must do Brahminical activity. If you're a Vaishya, you must do Vaishya activity, etc. But then, if you actually come to the transcendental platform, then you simply serve the Lord. And Prabhupada says, that is the real execution of Swadharma. Right, so verse 3. One should cease performing conventional religious practices and should be attracted to those which lead to salvation. One should eat very frugally and should always remain scheduled so that he can achieve the highest perfection of life. So yes, well, there's certainly a purport here, and it's important. Prabhupada says here that it's recommended here that religious practice for economic development or for sense gratification should be avoided. Rather, we should only do those things, religious practices, which will help us gain freedom from the clutches of material nature. So, at the beginning of Srimad Bhagavatam, it's stated that the topmost religious activity is that by which you can attain to devotional service, causeless devotional service. Yes. And if you get into that, then that sort of practice is never impeded. You'll always be able to get into it and become satisfied. So it is called here, the term moksha dharma is used in the second line of the Sanskrit. Moksha dharma means religious practice for salvation or for transcending material contamination. So, but of course, generally people do religious activities for economic development or sense gratification. But this is not recommended for those who want to advance in yoga. So there's a second paragraph here. So the next important phase in the verse, next important phrase is mita medhyadanam. One should eat very frugally, just eat very little. So in Vedic literature, it's recommended that a yogi eat only half of what he desires, according to his hunger. If you're so hungry that you could eat 1 pound, half a kilo of prasadam, then instead of eating half a kilo, 1 pound, he should consume only half of the pound, means 1/4 kilo, and supplement this with 4 ounces of water. Then 1/4 of the stomach should be left empty for the passage of air in the stomach. And if one eats in this manner, he will avoid indigestion and disease. And Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying that yogis should eat like this, and it's recommended in Srimad Bhagavatam, etc. Then it's said, the yogi should live in a secluded place where his yoga practice will not be disturbed. Verse 4. One should practice non-violence and truthfulness, should avoid thieving, and be satisfied with possessing as much as he needs for his maintenance. He should abstain from sex life, perform austerity, be clean, study the Vedas, and worship the supreme form of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So there's fairly extensive purport here. Prabhupada points out that the word Purusharchanam, which is the very last word in the whole verse, it means worshipping the Lord, especially the form of Lord Krishna. So Bhagavad Gita, though, confirms that Krishna is the original Purusha. So therefore in yoga, one not only must one concentrate his mind on the person of Krishna, but one must also worship the form or deity of Krishna daily. Second paragraph, brahmachari. Brahmachari practices celibacy and meant to be completely controlling his sex life. You cannot enjoy unrestricted sex life and practice yoga. Prabhupada says this is rascaldom. And, we should understand that when Prabhupada uses this word, rascal, or in this case, rascaldom, then it's a very strong statement. It's very strong. It's not like in the Western world, generally this word rascal, if it's used at all, it's generally used in relation to children. If children do some nonsense, then the mother may say, "Oh, you rascal, why did you do this or not do that?" So saying this, enjoying unrestricted sex life and practicing yoga, this is rascaldom. Srila Prabhupada is saying, well, how to put it in English, that you are just a big cheater. You're just no good at all. Or like in Russian, negode. You're just, means you're really bad, actually. So you must actually be celibate, must actually do that. Although some so-called yogis, they say you don't need to. You can go on enjoying as you like, simultaneously become a yogi, but this is unauthorized. Yeah. It's very clearly explained here that you have to observe celibacy. So brahmacharya means that one leads one's life simply in relation with Brahman or in full Krishna consciousness. That is real brahmachari life. And whereas those who are too addicted to sex life, they cannot observe the regulations which will lead them to Krishna consciousness. So sex life as such is only for married people. In fact, a person whose sex life is restricted in marriage means that he and his wife, they actually do engage in sex life, but simply for the purpose of producing nice Krishna conscious children. So householders, husband and wife who do like that, then the husband can also be called a brahmachari. So then in the third paragraph, Prabhupada points out the word asteyam is important for the yogi, to refrain from theft Oh, Krishna, what do you think of that? No stealing. And Prabhupada says, in the broader sense, everyone who accumulates more than he needs is a thief. And Prabhupada talks about spiritual communism means you can't possess more than you need for your personal maintenance. That is the law of nature. Anyone who accumulates more is called a thief. And one who simply accumulates wealth and doesn't spend it for sacrifice or worship of the Lord is a great thief. So then the fourth paragraph, Prabhupada points to the term, it's in the last line of the Sanskrit, swadhyaya, which means reading the authorized Vedic scriptures. So the thing is, even if you're not Krishna conscious, even if you are just practicing the yoga system and you're not trying to become a devotee, still, in order to understand what you're doing, you must read the standard Vedic literatures in order to understand. Performance of yoga alone is not sufficient. And Prabhupada refers to Srila Narottam Das Thakur, of course, great devotee in our line. And he says that we must take information, we must receive information about spiritual activity. He says that all spiritual activity should be understood from three sources: saintly persons, standard scriptures, and the spiritual master. These three guides are very important for progress in spiritual life. So the spiritual master prescribes standard literature for the prosecution of yoga, the yoga of devotional service. And he personally speaks only from scriptural reference. So Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, therefore reading standard scriptures is necessary for executing yoga. Practicing yoga without reading the standard literatures is simply a waste of time. On to verse 5. One must observe silence, acquire steadiness by practicing different yogic postures, control the breathing of the vital air, withdraw the senses from sense objects, and thus concentrate the mind on the heart. Right, okay. So Prabhupada begins the purport by saying that yogic practices in general, and Hatha Yoga in particular, are not ends in themselves, but what they are means to the end of becoming steady. Hatha Yoga, of course, refers to basically asana, and maybe pranayam, but particularly asana in the Ashtanga Yoga system. So, okay, first of all, you have to sit properly, and then the mind and attention will become steady enough for practicing yoga. So then, once you've done that, gradually you must control the circulation of vital air. And then with such control, one may be able to withdraw the senses from sense objects. So, of course, in the previous verse we just read, it was stated that one must observe celibacy. And Srila Prabhupada makes the point that this is the most important part of sense control. Yes. The most important aspect of sense control is controlling sex life. That's called brahmacharya, of course. So Srila Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, by practicing the different sitting postures and controlling the vital air, one can control and restrain the senses from unrestricted sense enjoyment. So on to verse 6. Fixing the vital air and the mind in one of the 6 circles of vital air circulation within the body, thus concentrating one's mind on the transcendental pastimes of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So this is called samadhi, or samadhana of the mind. So Prabhupada makes the point, there are 6 circles, as stated in the verse, 6 circles of vital air circulation within the body. First is within the belly, second is in the area of the heart, third is in the area of the lungs, fourth is on the palate, the fifth is between the eyebrows, and the highest, the 6th circle, is above the brain. Okay. So one is meant to fix one's mind and the circulation of the vital air, and thus think of the Lord's pastimes. Vaikuntha Lila. Yes. Vaikuntha Lila, the Lord's pastimes in the spiritual world. Prabhupada makes the point that it's never mentioned. It is never mentioned that one should concentrate the mind on something impersonal or void. Rather, as stated here, Vaikuntha Lila. Yeah. So through devotional service, consisting of particularly hearing and chanting of the Lord's pastimes, you can achieve this concentration. As Srimad Bhagavatam says, the Lord comes and goes according to his relationships with different devotees. And the Vedic literatures, of course, they contain so many descriptions of pastimes of the Lord, like the Battle of Kurukshetra, that's there in Mahabharata, in Bhagavad Gita, all the lives of the devotees, like Prahlad, Dhruva, Ambarish, also from Srimad Bhagavatam. So the thing is, Prabhupada then goes on to say that you only need to concentrate your mind in one such narration, but you should always absorb your mind in it. Then you'll be in samadhi. And Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, samadhi is not an artificial bodily state. It is the state achieved when the mind is virtually absorbed in thoughts of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So now we go on to verse 7. By these processes, or any other true process, one must control the contaminated, unbridled mind, which is always attracted by material enjoyment. And one must thus fix himself in thought of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So, Srila Prabhupada refers to the first words in the verse, etar anyais cha, means by these practices or by other practices, the contaminated mind must be controlled in one way or another. In this way, in that way, but just in some way, you must remember Krishna. Must be focused on the Lord and not on something impersonal or void. And therefore, for this reason, so-called yoga practices of voidism and impersonalism are not recommended in any standard yoga shastra. That's interesting, isn't it? You just don't find them. So the real yogi is the devotee because his mind is always concentrated on the pastimes of Krishna. And therefore Krishna consciousness is the topmost yoga system. So on we go, devotees, to verse 8. After controlling one's mind and sitting postures, one should spread a seat in a secluded and sanctified place. Sit there in an easy posture, keeping the body erect, and practice breath control. Sitting in an easy posture is called swasti samasina. Yes, that you find, where do you find it? In the third line of the Sanskrit, swasti samasina. So it's recommended in yoga scriptures that you put the soles of your feet between the two thighs and ankles and sit straight. That posture will help concentrate the mind on the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And Bhagavad Gita 6th chapter recommends this very process. Plus it's further suggested that to sit in a secluded, sanctified place, and the seat should consist of deerskin and kusha grass topped with cotton. Verse 9. The yogi should clear the passage of vital air by breathing in the following manner. First, he should inhale very deeply, then hold the breath in, and finally exhale. Or, reversing the process, the yogi can first exhale, then hold the breath outside, and finally inhale. This is done so that the mind may become steady and free from external disturbances. So Prabhupada gives a shortish purport. So these breathing exercises are done to control the mind and fix the mind on the Lord. And the famous verse of or regarding Ambarish Maharaj is quoted, the first line at least, very well known, Savaimana Krishna Padara Vindai O, that Ambarish Maharaj fixed his mind on the lotus feet of Krishna 24 hours a day. So the process is, particularly for us, but Prabhupada just says, this is the process. Chant Hare Krishna and hear the sound attentively, so the mind is fixed on Krishna's name, because Krishna's name is non-different from Krishna. And then, if you do that, then the whole purpose of controlling the mind by clearing the passage of life air, which the verse was talking about, then it's achieved immediately if we fix the mind on the lotus feet of Krishna. Yeah. So the Hatha Yoga process or breathing system, Prabhupada says, is especially recommended for those who are very absorbed in the concept of bodily existence. But if you can simply chant Hare Krishna, you'll be able to fix your mind more easily. So then on to the second paragraph. In order, if you really want to clear the passage of the breathing, if you really want, then 3 different activities are recommended for that. Puraka means inhaling, or puraka. Kumbhaka means sustaining it within, holding the breath in. And rechaka means finally inhaling. And as the verse said, you can always do it in the reverse way. First of all, exhale, then hold the air outside, then inhale. So then Prabhupada talks about interesting thing. The nerves through which inhalation and exhalation are conducted are technically called Ida and Pingala. And the ultimate purpose of clearing those passages, Ida and Pingala, is to divert the mind from sense gratification, basically. Bhagavad Gita, Krishna tells us in Bhagavad Gita, the mind can be your friend or your enemy, according to how you deal with it. Yes. So if you let your mind go to sense gratification, it's an enemy. But rather, if you concentrate the mind on the lotus feet of Krishna, it's a friend, it's your best friend. Yeah. So anyway, by this yoga system of Puraka, Kumbhaka, Rechaka, or alternatively, by directly fixing your mind on the sound of Krishna or the form of Krishna, same purpose is achieved. However, chanting is easier. It's not really mentioned here so much, but in other places we've seen, in principle, the same point being made, that there's a certain process, then there's the process of chanting, the direct process. So the same principle applies here. So in Bhagavad Gita, though, doing some sort of breathing exercise is recommended if you're doing yoga, if you want to do yoga. Right, it may help you to attain Him, attain Krishna, or help you fix your mind constantly on Krishna. Then third paragraph. So Prabhupada makes, well, the point we mentioned actually, practicing this yoga system with breathing and breath control, it's very difficult for people in Kali Yuga. So therefore Lord Chaitanya recommended Kirtaniya Sadahari, just chant Hare Krishna. And the name Krishna, there are many names of the Lord, but particularly the name Krishna is the most suitable name. The name Krishna and Krishna himself, they're non-different. And Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, therefore, if one concentrates his mind on hearing and chanting Hare Krishna, the same result is achieved. All right, so verse 10, the yogis who practice such breathing exercises are very soon freed from all mental disturbances, just as gold, when put into fire and fanned with air, becomes free from all impurities. So Prabhupada, again, particularly, well, exclusively really, focuses on the process of purifying the mind as recommended by Lord Chaitanya. One should chant Hare Krishna. And then further, not simply chanting Hare Krishna, but you can do it in Sankirtan, All glories to Sri Krishna Sankirtan. And if you do it nicely, well, all glories to that process, because if you do it nicely, then as soon as you begin, the mind is purified. Cheto Darpana Marjanam. By chanting the holy name of Krishna, one is cleansed of dirt in the mind. So you can purify the mind either by the breathing process or the chanting process. Just as you can purify gold by putting it in fire or by fanning it with a bellows. All right, so verse 11. By practicing the process of pranayama, one can eradicate the contamination of his physiological condition. And by concentrating the mind, one can become free from all sinful activities. By restraining the senses, one can free himself from material association. And by meditating on the Supreme Personality of Godhead, one can become free from the three modes of material attachment. So, according to Ayurveda, medical science, kapha, pitta and vayu, phlegm, bile and air, maintain the physiological condition of the body. Of course, modern medicine doesn't agree with that, but the ancient Ayurvedic process is based on it. And Ayurveda concerns itself with the causes of kapha, pitta and vayu, phlegm, bile and air. And they are mentioned, this is all mentioned in many places in the Bhagavatam as being the basic conditions of the body. So here it's being recommended that, first of all, by practice of pranayama, you can be released from contaminations from these three elements, kapha, pitta, vayu. And secondly, by concentrating the mind, you can become free from sinful activities. And thirdly, by withdrawing the senses, you can free yourself from material association. So we go on to the second paragraph. Ultimately, we have to meditate on the Lord in order to be elevated to transcendence. Bhagavad Gita confirms that anyone who does unalloyed devotional service immediately becomes transcendental to the modes and realizes his Brahman nature, Sagunan Samatichaitan Brahma Bhuya Kalpate. That's Bhagavad Gita 14:26. And Prabhupada makes the very interesting point that for every item in the yoga system, there's a parallel activity in Bhakti Yoga. But Bhakti Yoga is easier in this age than this yoga system, Ashtanga Yoga or whatever other yoga system other than Bhakti Yoga. So in other words, what Lord Chaitanya introduced is not just some new idea. It's very traditional, very shastric. And Bhakti Yoga begins with hearing and chanting. Prabhupada makes interesting point that all the yogas, every yoga begins with hearing and chanting, but they all have as their goal the Supreme Lord. But one is practical and the others are difficult. So Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, one has to purify his physiological condition by concentration and by restraint of the senses, then he can fix his mind on the Supreme Personality of Godhead. That is called samadhi. So actually, there's one more verse in this section, verse 12. Let us just quickly go through it. When the mind is perfectly purified by this practice of yoga, one should concentrate on the tip of the nose with half-closed eyes and see the form of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So here, it's very clearly stated that Bhagavata means the Supreme Lord. We have to meditate on the Supreme Lord, or Kashtam Bhagavata, an expansion of the Lord. So Kashtam refers to Paramatma actually, and Bhagavata refers to Lord Vishnu. So of course the original form is Lord Krishna, and then next is his first expansion, Balaram, then Sankarshan, Aniruddha, Vasudeva, and Pradyumna, then the Purusha avatars. Yes, so Prabhupada mentions that, as mentioned in the previous verse, which said Purusharchanam, if you remember, this Purusha is represented as the Supersoul Paramatma, and a description of the Supersoul on whom one must meditate if you're following that system of yoga and not Lord Chaitanya's system. So anyway, that'll be given, that description of the Supersoul, in the following verses. In this verse, it's clearly stated, one must meditate by fixing the vision on the tip of the nose, concentrating one's mind on the Kala, means the plenary expansion of Lord Vishnu. Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.